The man was walking through an old alley when he heard a faint cry coming from a trash bin along the wall. When he lifted the lid, he froze. Not because of what he saw, but because of the words the boy whispered, trembling. If it were you, what would you do when faced with a child begging not to be taken back to the place he calls home? Michael used a soft cloth to quietly wipe the creases of an old pair of boots, as if he were tracing the edges of memory. They were the combat boots his younger brother Ethan wore during his final missions near the thin line between life and death. But his memory of Ethan didn't start there. When Michael was 12, he had once seen Ethan crawling out of a locked bedroom clutching his stomach. Their mother didn't ask, and their stepfather merely muttered, "He just fell." Before returning to his cigarette in the kitchen, Ethan didn't cry. He bit his lip, shoved an ice pack into Michael's hands, and whispered, "Don't say anything. I'm fine." Michael said nothing, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't know what to say. He stood frozen outside that door for 20 minutes, just listening, waiting to see if there would be any more sounds that night. But the house stayed silent, too silent, like the eerie calm before a storm no one sees coming. Since the day Ethan was gone, those boots were never tucked away in a closet like a keepsake. Michael continued to clean them regularly, like a private ritual no one needed to witness. He didn't polish them because they were beautiful or valuable, but because it kept his hands from being idle, gave his fingers something to do when his mind suddenly wanted to rewind time and ask, why? Why didn't I open that door? Why didn't I speak up for my brother Michael? Landry stood up and ran the tap over his hands for a long time, as if trying to wash off a feeling he couldn't name. He grabbed his old brown coat from the hook behind the door and slung it over his shoulders in a movement so familiar it seemed automatic. He didn't know where he was going. No one was waiting for him. But he walked out of that house anyway, like he had so many times before, because sometimes you step outside not to look for something, but just to ease the pressure building inside. As his hand touched the latch, Michael paused for a moment. Not because he had forgotten something, but as if waiting for a familiar sound to call out from behind him. Nothing came. No voices. No sounds. Just the faint rustle of wind brushing against the metal roof. He opened the door and gently closed it behind him, as though trying to preserve a small, quiet peace inside the house. Some places keep drawing you back even if no one remembers your name there. Not because they're good places, but because they were once the last place you felt like you existed for a reason. Maybe not a clear one, but not a meaningless one either. The streets weren't crowded. A few figures here and there, people like him with no urgency, no destination. Just walking because sitting still would make the noise inside louder than any car horn. As he passed a small diner on the corner, a boy wiping tables looked up and gave him a shy, messy smile. Michael nodded back without lingering. The boy looked about 10, the age Ethan used to be when he would strum his old guitar and hum songs that never had a proper start or end. His steps were slow, steady, unhurried. As he turned down the alley behind the Haven Motel, a sound made him stop. At first he thought it was a cat or a piece of tin rattled by the wind, but when it came again, Michael froze. It was the sound of shallow, restrained breathing, like someone trying to cry but not strong enough to make a full sound. The sound of someone who no longer hoped to be saved but couldn't help making noise anyway. No flashlight, no calling out. Michael walked quietly toward the row of trash bins at the end of the alley. His boots stepped through old food scraps, but he didn't slow down. The smell of grease and waste didn't stop him. What makes people hesitate is rarely the smell, but the fear of what they might see. Once, as a young soldier, Michael had found a child tied up in the storage room behind an old bar. The boy didn't scream or cry. He just stared into the air. That look stayed with Michael ever since. So when he heard those faint sounds now, it was like something from that memory pulled him forward. He reached out, lifted the lid of the trash bin slowly, trying not to make a loud noise. The hinge creaked anyway, making him wince, but his eyes stayed locked on what was inside. A small body curled up like a shadow, hoping not to be named, arms hugging knees, head tucked into thin arms. The child wore a shirt so worn it was impossible to tell what color it had once been. The sleeve was frayed like an old wick. A dark stain covered the left shoulder as if he had just rolled through muddy oil. There was no need to ask why the boy was there. One look was enough. Some children don't look for a hiding place, they look for a spot fear can't reach. When the light from a distant shop fell on him, the boy shivered and pulled back. A small, trembling voice broke the air. "Please, please don't. I was good. Please don't take me back." Michael didn't say a word. He took off his coat carefully, laid it down on a dry patch of concrete, and sat a little distance away. Not so close that the child would feel afraid, but close enough for him to know Michael wasn't leaving. "I'm not the one you're hiding from. I'm someone who once had to hide just like you." He wasn't expecting an answer. He said it more for himself to keep from feeling powerless. The silence stretched on for a few more minutes. No one spoke. The faint scent of grilled meat from a distant restaurant floated by, mixed with the acrid smell of old drains. But none of it was louder than the boy's soft breathing as he tried to disappear inside himself. Michael leaned down a little more, still keeping his distance. He spoke again gently. "If you're cold, I have a coat. It's not new, not clean, but it's still warm." The boy didn't answer, but a few seconds later he slowly turned around. His wide, dark eyes gleamed with fear and suspicion. His forehead was smudged with dust and dried blood. One corner of his mouth was cracked, but what struck Michael most was his gaze. It wasn't the look of a 6-year-old. It was the look of someone who had long stopped expecting to be rescued. No sudden moves, no reaching out. Michael took a small cloth from his pocket, laid it on his knee, then slowly rested one hand on it, open and empty, showing only patience. "What's your name?" The boy didn't answer, but he pulled something from his shirt pocket and held it out. Michael took it. It was a small photo, its edges frayed. A woman with long hair smiled warmly from the picture. Her eyes held a tenderness that made Michael's chest ache. "Is this your mom?" The boy nodded, just barely, like even a firm nod might shatter something fragile. Michael looked at the photo again, then carefully handed it back. "Does she know you're here?" He wasn't expecting an answer. It was just a way to offer comfort. But the boy stayed silent. Michael nodded, not pushing. Then he took off his coat completely and wrapped it around the child, gently pulling him into an embrace. The boy didn't react. He didn't resist, didn't stiffen. His tiny frame didn't tremble, didn't lean in. It just stayed there, like it had quietly accepted something unspoken. And for Michael, that was a kind of consent more powerful than words. He stood up, lifting the boy into his arms. He was feather light, as if made of only bones and the things he'd lost. The boy kept the photo in his hand. He didn't cling to Michael's shirt or shoulder, but he rested his head against Michael's neck, worn out. "What's your name?" This time a near whisper came. "My name is Aiden." Michael didn't repeat the name. He only held the boy a little closer, just enough to know that from this moment on, at least one living person would know Aiden had existed and deserved a different kind of life. Aiden faced the wall. The hospital gown was too big and draped almost entirely over his small arms. He didn't cry, didn't stir. He just lay there, his back turned to the cold ceiling light that kept shining down as if it meant to illuminate things he wasn't yet old enough to understand. Outside the room, Michael sat still, separated by a pane of glass and a silence that no one had intended but had settled anyway. He held the folded photograph, the crease still visible in the corner, a cold cup of coffee beside his hand. He didn't say anything. Every time a nurse passed by, he nodded politely but never spoke. He had sat like that once before at age 12 outside the emergency room where his younger brother Ethan was taken as a child. Back then too, there had been that same sterile white light and another child who didn't cry. A young nurse approached holding a clipboard. She bent slightly, her voice low but clear. The boy is dehydrated and his physical development is far below what we would expect for his estimated age. There are signs of multiple injuries at different stages of healing. Bruises stretch along his arms and back. Most concerning, there's a perfectly round burn mark on his left shoulder, possibly from the tip of a cigarette. We've administered basic first aid, but every time someone gets close, he recoils like the entire room turns into a threat. Michael didn't react. He just stared at the glass. Has he ever slept anywhere without a lock on the outside? The nurse hesitated. "Sir?" Michael shook his head, lowering his hand gently as if to wave away both her hesitation and her answer. He wasn't asking for clarification. He was asking because somewhere deep in memory there had once been a child so afraid that he couldn't fall asleep knowing the door was locked. And Michael had forgotten that. For far too long. After a while, he stood up. He folded the photo and slipped it into his wallet, turned and began to leave. His foot hadn't yet stepped past the hallway when a small voice rose behind him, like a breath breaking in someone's chest. Mom said she'd be back before morning, but it's already morning. Michael stopped. He didn't turn around, didn't ask again. One heartbeat passed. Then maybe someone's keeping her from coming back. I'll ask around, see if I can find out. The overhead light kept humming in that quiet, sterile rhythm, dripping sound into the space like punctuation on something that had no name yet. Michael kept walking, but his steps no longer matched their old rhythm. His shoes touched the tile like he was feeling his way forward, each footfall carrying an unspoken question formed in the eyes of the boy behind him. At the intake desk, a woman was already waiting. Her hair was pinned neatly and she held a worn manila folder in one hand. The name tag pinned to her chest read, "Rachel Monroe, Child Protection Services." She didn't look at Michael like someone familiar, nor did she greet him like a stranger. She simply opened the folder and spoke in a tone that was steady but not harsh. "Are you the one who brought the boy in?" Michael nodded. "You're not related. Why did you take him to the hospital?" He didn't need time to think. He looked straight into her eyes, unblinking, and said in an even voice, "Because once I sat waiting alone and no one ever came." Rachel didn't write anything else in the file. She closed it and placed it on the desk like the words inside had suddenly become too heavy to carry. Her posture stayed upright, but her eyes no longer had the same certainty they had when she first walked in. Inside the hospital room, Aiden still lay on his side, eyes half open, not seeing, not blinking. The light overhead continued to shine, not promising anything except that it was still there. When Rachel turned to leave, Michael spoke again. His voice was deep and steady, each word chosen carefully. "I'm not going to ask where you plan to take him. He's probably used to being moved around without anyone explaining why, but I'm afraid if it happens again, he might stop trying to believe anyone ever again." Rachel looked up, meeting Michael's gaze. She didn't answer, but for the first time since walking in, her hand trembled slightly as she picked the file back up. The children's intake room had a pale blue bench, worn and faded where people had sat too long. Aiden had been moved there while they waited for further evaluation. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at anyone. He still held the photo Michael had given him. No one had taught him how to hold on to things, but he had already learned that the smallest things were often the last ones left. Michael stood on the other side of the doorway. He didn't step in. He wasn't watching, he was remembering. The boy's eyes made him face everything he had tried so hard to forget, things that would never show up in a case report. Rachel returned and stood beside him. She spoke not to him in particular, but out loud. We usually assess resilience, adaptability, and coping before we decide on a temporary placement. But for some kids, the first thing we should ask is whether they're still capable of trusting anyone. Michael didn't respond. He just began walking slowly toward the exit, then stopped when he heard a small voice call softly behind him. "Mister, if my mom comes back, can you tell her I'm not mad at her? Okay?" He didn't turn around. He just nodded, each nod like a promise carved in stone. Adults don't always have to rescue everything. Sometimes they only need to stay long enough for a child to understand that the dark isn't always the end of the road. Rachel didn't usually bring coffee into her office, but today she did. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the cup next to the keyboard. The computer screen still displayed the case lookup interface with the search bar, showing the name she'd read so many times it had become ingrained: Maria Collins. Nothing had changed, but every time she clicked, she still hoped something might be different, as if the truth could soften if looked at long enough with the right kind of hope. Maria. Gone without a word for over 4 months. She had worked the late shift at Hope's Diner, where coworkers remembered her for the little stories she told while rinsing glasses. The person who filed the report was a fellow waitress, not a relative, not a close friend. The case had been opened, but never expanded. To the system, a woman who disappears without a trace could simply be someone who left of her own will. The official notes included one lone sentence: no clear criminal element identified. Rachel leaned back, the cold of the chair back pressing into her spine. Sometimes people aren't afraid of conclusions. They're afraid of being forgotten. Under the glow of the monitor, she clicked on the notes related to the man Maria lived with, Trevor Collins. 2 reports of domestic violence, both closed without charges, the first after neighbors reported crashing sounds, the second after yelling then silence. Police arrived, but the victim didn't speak. The files were closed quickly, as if no one wanted to dig any deeper. Michael sat in the waiting room outside. He didn't ask anything. He didn't rush. His hands rested on an old medical journal, open midway but unread. His eyes were calm, deep, as though he wasn't there to listen so much as to breathe alongside the silence. Rachel walked out carrying the printed case file. She set it on the small table beside Michael. "I think you should read this." Her voice held no explanation. Michael flipped through the first few pages without haste. When he reached the section on the neighbor's report, his hand paused. His eyes settled on a floating line of text: unclear sounds, possibly a domestic dispute. His finger traced the words like touching an old scar. He spoke quietly, mostly to himself. "My mother used to say a noisy house still has hope. Noise means someone still reacts, still lives. But one afternoon I found my brother crushed under the bushes behind the house. That day I understood sometimes silence means life has already left." Rachel said nothing. His story needed no embellishment. In the adjacent playroom, Aiden sat on the carpet working on a puzzle. He didn't look at the adults. Didn't search for a reference image. He simply turned each piece slowly, one hand on his forehead, the other holding a piece that hadn't yet found its place. Rachel stepped in. Aiden looked up. Not startled, not shy. His voice was quiet, a little hoarse, like someone waking from a dream full of strange noises. "Are you the one who took my mom away?" The question fell into the room like dust touching water. No sound, but it stirred something. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't say no, but she couldn't say yes. She looked at Michael. He didn't speak, just watched Aiden with a gaze that had seen many things. "I didn't take anyone," she finally said. "But I haven't brought anyone back either." It wasn't an excuse. It was a confession. Aiden nodded and turned back to his puzzle. This time, he wasn't moving pieces randomly. He was sorting them by color. It still wasn't complete, but he had begun to choose. Rachel quietly stepped out of the room. She walked into the hallway, the pale sunlight filtering through the frosted glass. Michael was already there. Without looking at her, he asked, "Have you ever survived something?" Rachel smiled faintly, like testing if she still could. "I grew up with my mom and stepdad. When I was little, I used to think he was gentle. Every time Mom left the house, he bought me mango ice cream. Later, I found I couldn't eat mango anymore. Every time I opened the fridge and saw a tub of it, my stomach turned, not from cold, but from something I didn't know how to name. I told my mom. She stroked my hair and told me to go to bed early. The mango ice cream disappeared after that." But he didn't. Michael listened. No nods, no interruptions. After a while, he said, "I used to believe if I trusted adults enough, things would be okay. My little brother believed that too. He trusted me with a look that never doubted. One day I came home and the world he believed in was gone. By then, every explanation sounded like wind blowing through a door already closed." Rachel nodded. "And now here we are, trying not to be too late for another kid." They returned to the room. Aiden was drawing, not daisies, not smiling faces. He was sketching a wall, tall gray with cracks running from the inside out. Below it, a tiny man stood with his arms open wide. No face, no mouth, just two wide eyes waiting for something to break free from the cement. In the corner of the page, Aiden had written in uneven letters, "Walls talk a lot. Mom said not to listen to the walls." No one asked, no one corrected the spelling, no one explained. Sometimes a child's drawing says more than any file ever could. Children don't draw what they haven't lived. They don't imagine from thin air. They recreate what has already imprinted itself on their hearts. So when Aiden carefully colored each wilted petal of a daisy leaning against a window without sunlight, Michael understood this wasn't just an art session. It was emotional record-keeping written in colors and silence. The boy sat close to the window, far from the noisy children fighting over markers and blank paper. He didn't ask to join. He didn't borrow crayons. He brought his own, a few stubs of folded scrap of paper in his shirt pocket, and memories no one else could see. Michael didn't speak to him, didn't offer suggestions. He sat a few chairs away, watching each tiny movement. Occasionally, he adjusted the frayed collar of his shirt or pressed his shoes flat against the floor as if anchoring himself away from a memory too distant. One where his younger brother always appeared with that helpless look, the one that asked for kindness in a world that didn't offer it. Lauren Pierce arrived just as the last pages were stacked and the screech of chairs signaled the end of the session. Her leather jacket caught the moody gold of late afternoon light, softening the fatigue in Michael's eyes. She didn't greet him. No small talk, just a nod toward the exit. Michael understood instantly. He stood. They left like two people who had long agreed there was no need for extra words before beginning something important. "Are you ready to look him in the eye?" Lauren asked, hands still in her jacket pockets. "I didn't come to see his face. I came to see what's left under the concrete." The auto shop sat near the edge of the highway, its signs washed pale by years of rain, the smell of oil lingering like something that never left. Raymond Sanders opened the door with no cheer, no malice, just a tiredness that came from knowing more than one should. "I told the cops already. She came, then she left. I didn't keep anyone here." Lauren didn't reply. She pulled out her notebook and pen with practiced precision. Michael walked slowly toward the back where light didn't reach the concrete dip in the floor. He wasn't searching for something specific. He was listening. And the damp floor spoke more than any report. A patch of fresh cement covered older ground. The texture still rough, the color not matching, like a hurried cover-up. When Michael stepped on it, the sole of his shoe felt a pressure underneath, something still compressed, something that once hurt but now only exhaled silence. As Lauren kept talking with Raymond, Michael crouched as if adjusting his shoe eyes, never leaving the floor. His hand brushed the edge of a tile, finding a hairline crack just wide enough for a thin breeze to slip through and vanish. He stood, walked toward the side fence where weeds grew wild as if no one had walked there in years. Beneath the dry grass, among dirt and broken stone, something pressed faintly against his foot. Michael knelt. A small rectangular object, cracked and stained but still bearing a faded sticker on the lower right corner, a white daisy rimmed in blue. There is no need for questions, no more confirmations. Michael's eyes said it all. Only one person had ever chosen that daisy as her sign, and only one child had kept drawing it again and again, like clinging to someone now far away. Michael clenched it in his hand and walked back to Lauren. She looked up, stopped writing, eyes darkening as she saw what he held. No one spoke. She nodded, and the gesture carried more weight than any arrest warrant. Back in the car, Michael saw Aiden leaning against the window, not drifting, but watching the sky like it was asking him a question. In his hand was an old comic book, his fingers lightly squeezing the spine like trying to balance an emotion. When Michael opened the door, Aiden glanced over. His eyes paused just long enough to notice the item in Michael's hand. He didn't ask, didn't signal. He turned his head away like someone who already knew the story's ending. Later, when they returned home, Aiden set down a colored pencil, lightly touched a half-finished drawing, and whispered, "My mom had a phone that color. I heard it when the wall started screaming." Michael didn't respond. He sat quietly staring at the old patch of wall where a calendar used to hang, long since bare. There was nothing there now, but for him it was a place for what needed to be seen. Maybe someday it would hold another piece of evidence, cold and clear, or maybe it would show another of Aiden's drawings, one where the daisy no longer drooped but leaned toward the light. Not every silence means surrender. Sometimes silence is the only way the truth can gather enough time to speak for itself. Some things are buried not to hide them, but because people lack the courage to face them again. The late afternoon air was thick with the musty scent of old plaster, but what Michael Landry focused on was his shoes. On the worn leather, a reddish-brown stain had spread like it had once stepped into wet soil that never dried right. Heavy and clotted like dried blood. He only noticed it when Aiden stood a few feet away, his eyes not exactly frightened but alert in a way that suggested he recognized the color. Michael said nothing. He didn't turn away or try to hide it. Instead, he slowly bent down and removed the shoes, not to clean them, but to leave them at a distance from the doorway, the way someone might place a suspicious object outside their home. He stepped inside and took a damp cloth, wiping the threshold, not because it was dirty, but as if to reassure himself that this space remained clean, a place worthy of a child stepping into a different kind of doorway. Aiden looked at the bathroom door for a moment, measuring the distance between himself and a reluctant sanctuary. He didn't ask, didn't seek permission. He just turned and stepped inside, closing the door with a steady hand. The sound of water from the shower came soft and rhythmic like taps on dusty memories. Michael remained in place, leaning his head gently against the fridge, eyes momentarily clouded. His hand reached into his pocket out of habit, but found nothing except a folded note with his medication schedule. When Aiden emerged, his wet hair clinging to his forehead, Michael had already poured a glass of milk and set it carefully on the table. It no longer steamed, but it was still warm to the touch, like kindness that didn't wait to be acknowledged. Aiden sat on the stool, placing his hand on the table without touching the glass. He began to draw, not looking at Michael, not asking anything, only sketching with a black pencil. The lines looked like faint trails across old earth. A house with no roof, just 4 walls and a single exit. Michael watched him, his chest heavy as he noticed the boy's hand dragging the pencil across the page, not shading, not detailing, just scraping out what had been buried too long. When his phone buzzed in his pocket, he looked at the screen for a long time. A message from Lauren. The blood sample matches Maria. He didn't reply, didn't type anything back. He set the phone down, screen facing the table, and moved his chair closer to Aiden. The boy kept drawing as if nothing had happened. Elsewhere in the city, Rachel Monroe sat slumped behind the wheel of her parked car, the tires covered in dust. Her face rested against the steering wheel, her shoulders trembling in waves. There was no loud crying, no wailing, just the quiet cracking of someone who had held herself together too long. By the time she stepped into the youth center, the afternoon light had begun to fade. Aiden saw her, paused his hand, and asked like someone far older, checking on a friend. "You okay now?" Rachel froze briefly, her eyes not meeting his but drifting to the drawing at the edge of the table. She leaned down, picked it up, and ran her fingers gently over the dusty pencil lines. Her eyes didn't tear up, but they grew deep as if wading through memories buried in silence. The drawing showed a house with no fence trees bending to one side. She stared at it for a long time, like tracing an old road she knew by heart, but wasn't sure she could follow again. "Does this house have a back door?" she asked. Aiden shook his head, voice low and even, like something he had repeated in his mind many times. "No, just a wall. No way out, nothing to wait for. Anyone who goes around ends up coming back because there's nothing there." Michael stood out in the hallway holding a medical folder, watching through a crack in the door. He didn't step in. Some conversations he believed belonged only to 2 people. A third was best kept just outside. Lauren called him to the back patio of the center. The air was quiet there, only the sound of dry branches brushing the metal roof. She didn't begin with a question, but with a sentence she had chosen carefully. "I don't think you're wrong to be here, but no one's forcing you to stay either. So, what's keeping you?" Michael didn't answer right away. He sat down on a small wooden bench, rested his hands on his knees, and spoke slowly. "There was one night I knew something was wrong, but I stayed quiet. Closed my eyes like maybe it would just pass. The next morning, the person I loved most wasn't there anymore. Since then, I've learned to live with sleep that's never deep, with a shadow that follows me through every season. If I walk away now, I don't just lose that boy. I lose the last part of myself that once knew how to love at the right time." Lauren said nothing. She looked out toward the withered tree nearby and exhaled slowly. "I get it. Not the same way, but I get it." A message came through. She read it, her expression shifting before she handed the phone to Michael. "Trevor's at the East gas station less than 10 minutes ago. He's fueling up, acting normal." Michael nodded. No further questions. When they returned to the room, Aidan had packed up his drawings. He looked at Michael, not afraid, just searching for truth.
Do I have to go with him?
Michael sat down, didn't answer immediately. He moved closer, wiped a smudge of ink from Aidan's hand with a small cloth and said, "You don't belong to anyone. The one who needs to come back, that's him." Aidan didn't reply. But unlike before, he didn't pull his hand away. He let Michael hold it a few moments longer. The small hand was dry, cold, reluctant to trust but not wanting to disappoint. When he let go and walked away, Michael didn't stop him. He just watched. Aidan poured himself a glass of water, stood at the window watching the sunlight filter through, then returned to the table. He picked up a pencil and for the first time drew a house with a roof and a tilted doorway open inward. This time the drawing had a roof, but the window remained closed. The small barber shop was tucked between two rundown clothing stores, its sign faded and the front window coated in dust that hadn't been wiped in years. But the little metal bell above the door still chimed with a clear, bright sound every time someone stepped inside, as if it didn't care how much time had passed. The air smelled of old dye mixed with cheap peppermint oil, not unpleasant, just faintly nostalgic. There was something from decades ago lingering here, no matter who came in carrying their untold stories. Michael chose the seat by the window where the light filtered softly through the blinds. Aidan walked slowly as if the floor might give out at any step. He didn't hold Michael's hand but stayed close enough that the man could feel the tension radiating from the boy's small frame. Aidan glanced at the swivel chair, then at the silver scissors in the hairdresser's hand. He said nothing. Michael didn't say, "Don't be scared," or "It'll be fine." He simply took a worn picture book from his pocket and placed it in Aidan's hands. The boy didn't open it, only traced the pale blue trim on the first page where a bear in a coat stood before an open wooden wardrobe. The hairdresser, a woman with experienced eyes and a voice that didn't need sweetness, spoke aloud as if to herself. "This curl is natural, not common. If we trim it short, the shape will come through." Aidan didn't respond. He stared down at his knees. Michael nodded in agreement. When the scissors cut the first lock of hair, Aidan didn't flinch, but Michael saw his shoulders rise slightly like someone trying not to exhale too loud. Michael placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder and left it there. 3 minutes later, when the mirror reflected Aidan's face under his new haircut, the boy studied himself for a long time. He didn't ask if he looked nice. He didn't smile. He simply tilted his head as if waiting for a response from someone long gone. Then he whispered softly, "If Mom is watching from somewhere, would she still recognize me?" No one answered. The question hovered in the freshly swept room, not needing a reply, only presence. On their way out, Michael thanked the hairdresser with a small nod. She handed him a packet of tissues. "If the kid cries, give him this. Light lavender scent. Doesn't sting the eyes." Lauren was already waiting in the car, the AC off. She handed Michael a printout from the gas station surveillance camera, an image of Trevor Collins pumping gas, his expression calm, his eyes unremarkable. He got there 30 minutes ago, still there. No one turned on the radio during the drive. Aidan had been left with Aunt Maggie. Michael didn't speak. Lauren sat beside him, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror like she was making sure she hadn't missed anything. The gas station appeared after a bend in the road. The sky was washed out like it had been drained of color. A young man was checking his tires at pump 3. A woman carrying a baby stepped out of the convenience store. And at pump 2, Trevor Collins stood in a wrinkled white shirt nozzle in hand, eyes fixed on some nameless distance.
Michael didn't get out right away. He looked at Lauren. She had released the safety on the gun at her side but hadn't drawn it.
"He knows your face. Go slow." Michael stepped out unarmed. Every step toward Trevor felt like a step backward into memory to a man who had once loved a woman, once held a child, once bought a second-hand scooter to take his family to the beach. Trevor turned. He recognized Michael. At first there was nothing in his gaze. Then after a few seconds, the stillness cracked like a pond struck by stone. "You can't take him from me, he's mine." The shout echoed across the noisy lot. The gas nozzle fell fuel, splashing onto his shoes and soaking into the pavement. Lauren drew her weapon. "Hands on your head." Michael didn't draw anything. He took one step forward, then another. Trevor's eyes grew wild. He shouted, spittle flying. "The walls told me if I let him go, they'll take everything. Everything, nothing will be left." Local officers, already alerted, closed in from both sides and restrained him efficiently. Trevor was handcuffed, still repeating, "The walls know, the walls know, the walls know." Michael didn't look back. He turned away as Trevor was pushed into the patrol car. Meanwhile, back home, Aiden was sitting on the old tile floor surrounded by his colored pencils and sheets of paper. Beside him lay a handkerchief embroidered with the letter D, something Michael had once quietly placed on the living room shelf. Aiden had seen it one evening when Michael used it to wipe the frame of a faded photo showing a slender young man smiling brightly in front of an old bicycle. Michael hadn't said who it was, but his hand had paused for a few long seconds. Aiden drew a house with no walls, no door, no roof, just an empty frame surrounded by broken circles. He folded it, placed it into a small cardboard box and sealed it with clear tape. On the lid he wrote in shaky blue ink, "For Uncle Denis, if he still remembers the way here." No one had told Aiden that name. But sometimes children don't need to learn by hearing. They just watch a grown-up fall silent when a forbidden name is mentioned and they understand. Aiden simply chose to call the man by a name he had never heard spoken aloud. At the police station, Trevor was taken into the interrogation room. Lauren stood behind the one-way mirror. Michael stood beside her saying nothing. The fluorescent light bore down on Trevor's face. He looked around, blinking like the brightness stung his eyes. He sat still for a long time, then raised his head and stared straight at the mirror. "Can they see me?" His voice wasn't loud or threatening. Or do they only hear me, like that boy used to hear the walls? No one answered. Lauren glanced at Michael. He didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on Trevor as if looking through a warped old window into a world twisted by whispered lies. Some children aren't afraid of the dark because there's no light. They're afraid because the dark talks back, and once you live in a house where the walls scream silence, becomes a weapon too. Not everyone hears it, but those who have never forget. Michael quietly stepped out of the observation room. He didn't need to look back. A man who has heard the echo from the walls knows that what matters isn't answering back, but learning how to walk away without taking that voice with you. In the schoolyard at the end of the day, sunlight slanted through thinning trees like ink bleeding on old paper. Kids ran and laughed, their shouts rising and fading in broken rhythms. But Aiden was different. He walked slowly, head slightly bowed, fingers holding one shoelace like it was a string tying him to something far away. He tried to lace it, failed, then tried again with quiet patience. His breathing made no sound in the hush of late afternoon. Michael sat quietly on the stone steps, his hands folded like they were keeping something warm. His eyes followed Aiden, not just watching, but witnessing something slowly untangle from a long way back. Earlier, he had knelt to tie a shoelace, once no lectures or instructions. He kept just enough distance not to intrude, but not so far that the boy would feel alone. Aiden fumbled again. The third knot was wrong. He paused, stared at the laces as if looking for the reason behind their tangling. He didn't frown. He didn't get angry. He patiently undid it, bent over again, and tied it slower, firmer. When it held, he didn't say it loud, only murmured to himself, "If Mom sees this, I think she'd be happy." Michael placed a hand gently on the boy's head. No ruffle, no pat, just a touch. She sees. All mothers do. The pause that followed was long enough for the rustling leaves behind them to become a clear part of the conversation. Aiden turned to look at him, not quite sad, not quite peaceful. They left the schoolyard as the sky began to soften into the color of the day's end. On the way back, Lauren's phone rang. She had just finished closing a case involving a false missing child report. Michael didn't ask questions, but the way she glanced at him said enough. It's confirmed. There's no doubt anymore. It was Maria. They didn't say anything else, but as Lauren walked away, Michael called after her. At least this time someone believed her. In a small apartment at the end of a street near the market, Margaret Collins was boiling water for a foot soak. Her left knee ached more than usual, and the medicine cabinet had been empty for 2 weeks. When Rachel knocked, Margaret wasn't surprised. She put down her towel, dried her hands, and opened the door. Rachel hadn't brought any documents. She just sat down, placed a glass of lemonade on the table, and said gently, "If it's hard, you can tell the truth. No one's forcing you." Margaret didn't reply right away. She opened the drawer beneath the coffee table and pulled out a faded wooden box. Inside were old photos of Maria, all yellowed at the edges and slightly curled from humidity. She flipped through them slowly, as if retracing scattered pieces of memory, then stopped at one and placed it near Rachel. "I was never a good sister. Took her toys when we were kids. Later, we lived in cities so far apart I barely knew her anymore. I don't even know if she tied her laces in bows or just stuffed them inside her shoes. I didn't know anything." Rachel didn't interrupt. She slid the lemonade a little closer. "But the boy, he frowns like she used to. His eyes have that same light. If it weren't for this knee, I worry I couldn't keep up with him. You don't have to run beside him. Just be where he can find you if he looks back." Before the sun slipped behind the red-tiled roofs, Michael parked outside Margaret's apartment. He carried a warm box of cornbread and a sealed envelope in his shirt pocket. When she opened the door, just halfway like always, he didn't move closer. He kept enough distance that she wouldn't feel pressured. He didn't mention Aiden. He didn't plead. He simply held out the cornbread. Before he turned to leave, his voice low and steady, he said, "I was once a child with good adults around, but they didn't have the courage to stay. I still thank them, but I pity them more." That night, Aiden dug through his old pencil box and found a brown crayon. He didn't like the color, but it was the only one still whole. He sat beside Michael, carefully coloring a half-finished drawing. 2 people sitting side by side under a porch. One had gray hair. "Who are you drawing?" Michael asked gently. Aiden looked at him, then said suddenly, "I'm drawing Uncle Denis." Michael froze. His eyes stopped at the clumsy gray strokes where the color bled like water. He didn't correct the boy. He didn't react. He just sat there, his hand resting over his heart, steady. The silence stretched as if the room itself had stopped breathing. Then Aiden looked up, voice small but strong enough to shake something deep in Michael. "If you were Denny, you wouldn't leave me, right?" Michael didn't answer right away. He leaned down, touched the edge of the paper like straightening a crease. Denny was left behind. I don't want anyone else to carry that memory. Before bed, Aiden gently folded the finished picture and placed it in the old box where he kept his most important things. He took a small piece of paper and wrote in uneven letters, "For Uncle Denny, the one who stayed." Some names aren't meant to be called out loud. They exist so someone else has a reason to stay. When the picture of the daisy was torn in half, Aiden didn't look to see if the boy who had just spoken was still there. Only the soft thud of an eraser falling to the floor broke the stillness of the crowded classroom. The red crayon lay untouched on the desk, its tip bent as if from a short burst of anger. Michael sat on the farthest bench behind the frosted glass of the community room, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee still warm. He was used to that kind of look, the one that knows but chooses not to interfere. And some eyes, they only watch to see you disappear. No one ever explained to Aiden why people like to name other people's pain. He only understood that every time someone said something about his father, he lost a little more, like losing a tooth, a color from his crayons, or even the silence inside himself. Michael remained in the hallway, silent. He had grown used to giving Aiden space in class and waiting for him like a shadow just outside. On other days, the boy would always come running to ask if today's snack had cinnamon on it. But today was different. Aiden walked out without a word, holding half of a torn picture. The sun jagged the daisy stripped bare like something that had never gotten the chance to bloom. He held it up, not looking at Michael, and asked, "Do you know where daisies grow if there's no pot, no dirt, nothing at all?" Michael thought for a moment, then answered slowly, "Maybe they grow where someone is patient enough not to pluck away hope halfway." That afternoon, as they sat on the stone steps behind the library, Rachel called Michael. Her voice was steady, neither sad nor cheerful, but something in the silence between her words sounded worn, like a spoon stirring coffee too long. She said she was leaving South Haven Youth Center to take a job in Springfield at a shelter for abandoned kids. "It's not big, not sunny, but it seems like people cry less in hiding over there." Michael didn't ask why. He only asked when, then said, "Make sure you tell the boy. He doesn't ask much, but he hears better than we think." The next day, Rachel came to see Aiden. She brought a small bag with blank paper, a new box of crayons, and a stuffed bear named Ciro. Aiden didn't hug the bear. He just folded the paper in half lengthwise. He wasn't sad, didn't cry. When Rachel said goodbye, he drew a drooping daisy and a crooked sun, then tucked the sheet quietly into her jacket pocket and turned away. Elsewhere in town, the trial of Raymond Sanders went on quietly. His 3-year suspended sentence surprised no one. What people remembered was the old man standing in the hallway all morning, silent, never entering. His hand clutched an old silver coin with a worn-down cross, nearly smooth from time. No one asked why he came. He might have been a witness, or just someone who didn't want to remain uninvolved. That man was Michael. He knew well that not all crimes get judged in a courtroom. For some, simply surviving their own silence is punishment enough. After that, Aiden began sleeping more. He didn't cry, but often woke mid-dream. Margaret noticed he no longer feared sleeping alone, but never crawled under the blanket without someone reminding him. One evening, as she massaged her aching knee by the window, Aiden walked over. He didn't ask anything, just stared for a while, then suddenly said, "Does it really hurt, or are you just scared?" Margaret froze, her hand tightening on her knee. The question wasn't an accusation or a doubt. It was like a mirror showing her what she hadn't dared face. She exhaled softly, then stood. Without a word, she picked Aiden up, not because he needed carrying, but because she needed to prove to herself her arms could still hold something good. That day, for the first time, she took Aiden for a walk without asking Michael to pick them up. They strolled around the old square past benches with broken legs replaced by crates. Aiden didn't speak, only reached up and touched her hair gently when she bent to tie his shoes. It wasn't a gesture of affection, more like checking how low an adult could bend when they meant to help. A few days later, Michael visited the social center to withdraw from all the guardianship procedures. He didn't give notice, didn't ask for help. He left an unmarked envelope tucked into Claudia's old notebook. Inside, he had written, "Some people are only meant to walk part of the road together, but if they come at the right time, they help each other never turn back to the place where they once went numb." On his way out, Michael didn't look back at the building. He knew some things, when revisited, only remind you of your past cowardice. And for a man like him, simply not running away anymore was the first step toward forgiveness. Somewhere in a nearby park, a real daisy had bloomed in the palm of a child waiting to be called by name, in a voice untouched by the past. Nobody mentioned the weather, but everyone felt it. The way leaves lingered longer on the ground, as if even they didn't want to leave.
Late year in South Haven always carried the scent of incense and unsaid things, a smell that made people slow their pace, lower their voices, and think more deeply about what needed no words. Aiden gently placed a colored drawing on the still damp soil. He didn't clasp his hands or close his eyes, just smoothed the wrinkled paper. One side held a large red crayon daisy uneven, the other a sun with rays longer than necessary. His mother's name was written in slanted print at the corner, the ink smudged from a not quite dry hand. Michael stood 3 steps behind, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on Aiden but without intruding. Not out of hesitation, but because he understood some grief only asks to be witnessed. Years ago, when Ethan was laid to rest beneath cold soil, Michael had stood exactly that distance away, not crying his eyes dry in a way that felt unnatural. He still remembered the crooked cross on the grave and how no one ever came back to fix it. Lauren arrived late holding a crumpled newspaper-wrapped package of pastries. No condolences, no forced hugs. She simply placed the bundle next to an old paper bouquet and sat on the edge of the stone step. After a few minutes, she tilted her head and asked just loud enough not to break the moment, "Feel like eating something?" Aiden didn't look up, but his fingers brushed the paper and he whispered, "Thanks." The air was neither heavy nor light. It was like watching a grown-up finally learn how to step gently across a child's memory. Not every wound needs tears to be acknowledged. Some just ask you to stand close. Days later, the final decision was made official. Margaret would become Aiden's legal guardian. He would now carry the Collins name recorded fully in the court documents. Michael didn't attend the signing. He sent no letter, no gift, no words. But across the street under the olive tree he planted 10 years earlier, he stood waiting. He watched Margaret take Aiden's hand, saw the boy tighten his grip slightly as she knelt to fix his shoelaces. Michael didn't approach. He didn't need to. His eyes were there, a quiet vow without a rope. Elsewhere not far away, Trevor Collins had been transferred to a forensic psychiatric facility. His new room had a window facing a bare courtyard. No trees, just white tiles and 2 plastic chairs. The attending psychiatrist later noted, "He still talks to the walls, but now the walls don't answer." No visitor requests, no letters. One staff member recalled seeing him punch his own chest, muttering that his son was the last one who ever listened. But the words no longer carried rage. They sounded like someone whispering to themselves, trying not to forget they once existed.
Lauren had invited Michael to their usual coffee shop, the one where time seemed paused in every scratch of its old wooden tables. The grinder still whined like a habit that refused to stop. She stirred her dark espresso, slowly, eyes watching a faint pool of light on the floor, then said as if reciting an old memory. "When I was little, I heard my dad threaten to hold my mom's head underwater if she kept talking to strangers. I didn't fully get it back then. Just knew I started avoiding the tub than any lake. It took years before I realized the fear wasn't natural. It was a scar. Maybe if someone had let me tell that story, I would have learned to float instead of just sink." Michael didn't ask anything. He just said, "I think a lot of people learn to swim not to move through water, but to survive something they can't get out of." Lauren smiled, not because she felt better, but because she knew he had said it, not as comfort, but as truth from his own silence. It wasn't advice, but a shard of quiet years in a kitchen that had lost its voices. Sometimes sincerity doesn't need to be loud, just timely. That evening, Michael returned to the old house on Willow Street. It looked the same. The roof sagged on one side, the stucco walls blotched like aged skin. He didn't go in, just stood under the wild tree that had grown near the shingles. There, beneath layers of dust and dry earth, were Ethan's old boots, once polished weekly, now cracked, worn, one lace broken. Michael stood still, gaze locked on the battered boots. He didn't bend down, didn't reach. He just let his feet stay planted, as if asking whether to lift something from the past. Streetlights spilled across the ground, lengthening his shadow like an unhealed scar. Some things don't have to be buried to be lost, but if you never let go, they'll haunt you forever. Maybe he couldn't forget, but he had learned to keep walking without carrying every weight that once made him stop. People who live long, he thought, aren't always stronger. They're just the ones who figured out what not to carry. The ice cream shop stood at the corner of two old streets where chipped pavement stones still held the footprints of those who paused for something gentle. The hand-painted sign had faded, but the name Hope Creamery was still legible if you looked closely. The breeze carried a whiff of vanilla blended with the soft jingle of the doorbell. Inside, light reflected softly off Aiden's strawberry ice cream. He leaned back, head tilted, debating which scoop to eat first. He licked one edge, then looked up at Michael with eyes too clear for his age. "I don't get scared anymore when the ice cream guy asks where my mom is," Aiden said. His voice wasn't quite confident or sad, just something accepted, past, and now calmly spoken. Michael nodded. He didn't ask why. Instead, he took a napkin and gently wiped a smear of pink from the boy's chin. "Some things," Michael said slowly, "when you stop avoiding them, others stop poking at them too, like the sun. It doesn't ask who used to fear the dark, it just rises." Aiden closed one eye, peering through the window where dust particles danced in the light. "Do you think light hears us?" Michael didn't reply. He placed his hand near Aiden's on the table, not touching, just close. It was enough for Aiden to finish his ice cream. The afternoon passed like a steady breath, unrushed. There were no loud laughs, no music playing from the corner speaker, but everyone in the creamery seemed to keep their own slow reasons. A girl with lopsided braids listened to her grandmother's hum. A middle-aged woman wrapped pastries with care, as if wrapping memories, and near the window, a silver-haired man and a boy, not related by blood, sat quietly in the light, knowing some waits can't be hurried. That evening, when they got home, Michael checked the mailbox. Inside was a small letter written in uneven green pencil. On the front it said, "To Uncle Ethan." He carried it inside like something fragile. Sitting by the window where the light no longer burned bright but still made it through the shutters, he opened it. The scent rose, familiar school crayons, fresh paper, and something like belief once dormant. Today, I didn't hide from the walls anymore. I drew a window, and you were sitting there like always. Next week, I'll draw another person. I think if the room has enough people, the light won't need to ask permission to come in. Michael read it over and over. He didn't cry, didn't smile, but his hands stayed wrapped around the edges, holding onto something delicate. On the table, Rachel's old postcard from Springfield remained a sketch of a flame tree and scribbles from a little girl. On the back it read, "Aiden isn't just a kid who needed saving. He's the reason I didn't give up when I saw my own past in the mirror." The card rested beside the old clock that had long stopped ticking. The minute hand still pointed to 3, as if time had chosen to pause at the moment Michael opened that trash bin long ago. He had never fixed the clock. Partly because he didn't need the time, partly because some things, when they stop at the right moment, are meant to stay still. That afternoon, the park wasn't dazzling. It wore a quiet brown of fallen leaves and the soft scatter of shoes on pavement. Aiden was playing on the carousel with other kids, his smile unfolding like an old shirt sun-dried after a long rain. For the first time, Michael noticed he no longer glanced back every few minutes. Far off by the fountain, an old man scattered crumbs for pigeons, while a young person sketched uncertain strokes on a pad. Everyone seemed to be doing something small enough to keep the day meaningful, but big enough not to feel forgotten. Michael's phone buzzed. A single message from Lauren. "There's a boy missing in Greenville. The report says he's afraid of light." He didn't frown or move fast. He looked toward Aiden, now resting under a tree flushed from play, but light in the eyes. A child who once hid in a trash bin could now shout his name in a park. That wasn't magic. That was someone choosing to stay. Michael approached. Aiden looked up. "You'll be back right next Tuesday, like always. Think we should try mango ice cream, only if it comes with chia seeds." "You got it." Aiden grinned, then hugged Michael. Not tight, not sudden, but real. The hug of a child who knows he won't be left behind. Michael turned away while the sun was still out. No one called him, no one gave him orders, but the car was waiting by the curb and inside a new file. He opened his phone and replied to Lauren, "I'm coming. I once knew how to talk to someone who trusted no one." The car pulled onto the old asphalt. The engine wasn't loud, but enough to remind Michael he was leaving a moment he wouldn't forget. In the rearview mirror, Aiden still swung on the jungle gym, his messy hair in small wave, a soft farewell to something that had finally become familiar. Michael didn't turn back. He didn't need to. He knew the boy believed he'd return. The sun at the end of the road didn't paint the sky red. It left only a pale streak like the underline of hope. Michael didn't need bright light. For him, a faint gleam was enough to move forward. Some promises don't need to be repeated. They just need one person to keep them quietly with no reminders. Maybe what makes this story resonate isn't only the wounds of a child once abandoned. It's the silent, steady decision of a man who wasn't his father, but chose to stay. In a world where cruelty hides behind ordinary faces, people like Michael choose not to live ordinarily. They live responsibly. And that quiet act changed the life of one boy and his own. We often ask, how does evil last so long? Maybe the better question is, who stayed silent after the first cry for help? In this story, evil was exposed. And goodness, though late, came in time to help one soul rise again. Have you ever met someone like Michael? Or ever been like Aiden, just needing one grown-up to stay a little longer? If you've witnessed something unfair that still weighs on your heart, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Where are you living these days? How's your health been lately? Is there anything that's been weighing on your heart? Don't hesitate to share with us, because this isn't just a place for stories. It's a place where people like you are heard and understood. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the final line. We'll see you again in the next story where light always finds its way through the cracks in life.